So we'll start with a reflection from BRANDE and Lynn, who will do a joint reflection and then run through the panelists. BRANDE.
It's the other presentation. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. Lynn and I are going to represent work that we've been doing with the Duke-Margolis effort on RWE and regulatory decision-making. I'll bring the sponsor perspective, and Lynn will bring the data aggregator perspective. And I will also say this talk is much simpler than what it appears on the surface. There are many, 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 many hours of discussion that happen around this topic. So forgive me for the simplicity, but happy to discuss in more detail after the session. So the Duke-Margolis RWE Framework was released in 2017 in September, and it's really helping to understand how we can better shape the guidance for use and application of real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making. As part of that, we really need to dig down into the data quality and the credibility of that, of this type of research. And although they are two separate topics, they're very interrelated. It's very hard to separate those, and it's a very iterative process. So with great anticipation, we'll be releasing that work from Duke-Margolis in October of 2018. This is coming from a perspective of a pharmaceutical company. I will state these are my own views and not necessarily the views of Eli Lilly and Company. So real-world evidence, there's many, many different definitions, but they're all defined by the use of the real-world data. For Eli Lilly and Company, we start with the research questions in the context of the decision, and we move methodically through the research question to the data to the design and analytics, and that's how we define real-world evidence. There are common themes about real-world data, but again, nothing that is commonly accepted. So it's a lot of words about routine, not collected in randomized controlled trials, not collected in the clinical trial setting. So one thing we need to do is merely make sure that we're clear on what we call real-world data. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm defining real-world data in this way. There's a wide variety of possible real-world data sources, and an industry sponsor, we think about all of these sources as we try to answer and tackle the questions. It can go anything from what we call traditional real-world sources that are administrative claims, electronic medical records. We also do primary data collection and informal observation studies. We think about patient registries and disease states, national public health surveys, connecting directly with patients and providers, pragmatic trials where we're randomized and then watching patients in a more naturalistic setting, all the way to non-traditional data where we still have a lot of work to do to understand the validity and reliability of that data in the social media and patient-generated health data. We also will think about using hybrid approaches or linked data for secondary use. So again, we never ever start a discussion about real-world evidence without having the context of the decision in mind. The context of the decision drives the data quality and the level of credibility of the evidence and statistical certainty that you have to have. So again, we start the research question. In these cases, I think the regulator is thinking about, is the drug safe and effective? Possibly an expanded population with different dosing schedules and a subpopulation. In a very small population, unlikely to have a clinical trial in a new disease state. We may also be looking at, are there additional benefits or claims in an already approved indication. From there, then you start thinking about the data elements of interest. This is what I'm going to actually call data relevance, which you'll see as a theme that comes out of the Duke-Margolis work. First, we start with, do accepted standards exist? So if we have validated ways of getting that information, so for example, the major adverse cardiac events have been done in claims data, have really been extensively studied through chart reviews and others. So if we're looking there, let's go to a source that is proven and a methodology is proven. Many times our methodologies are not proven. And so what we do is really think about the key data elements, and we search out, we're kind of like detectives. What is it that is bringing systematic bias? That will first impact your data relevance. And so we actually look at the entire decision tree. We don't ever try to go directly down a path of a data element because there are so many possibilities. And so we want to make sure we're having the most appropriate data for that particular question. And because the data is rapidly evolving, if you assume you already know all the data sources out there, you're wrong. And so really we want to make sure that we're looking at existing sources and thinking about a wide range of things that might come from clinical care. So example, traditional settings, registries, claims data, EMR data, linked data, or patient-generated health data that's more done in a naturalistic setting from the patient. And then sometimes not all of these things can be found, and so we'll go then to looking for how can we create those data sets in a more prospective manner. So again, we're starting to think about what exists before we think about creating new. And so there's times when we can start with something, claims data, and then link it with a survey. But sometimes we do have to go into primary data collection. But primary data collection does put systematic bias into the system. So there is systematic bias no matter what route you take. When we're thinking about EHR, we're really thinking about the differences between primary care, hospital, or specialty care. And that really is meant to facilitate the discussion between the healthcare providers and the patients. In claims, it's all about the finances. There's different types of claims: inpatient, outpatient, pharmacy, enrollment. Registries are kind of special. We're looking specifically for research purposes. They're designed there. They have a lot of strength in large populations, but again, we're looking at patient disease states. And then there's public sources where a lot of times they're weighted for the US population, like for example, NHANES, which is a very extensive medical review of individual patients, very carefully chosen to be representative of the US population. In patient-generated health data, I think we're still looking at how to validate these in real life. They can either be passive, like walking around and gathering your Fitbit information, to active, I'm actually inputting the information as a patient into a survey type of device. When you think about primary data collection, are you doing that in clinical care, or are you doing that in real life? Again, there's sources of bias in every approach that we take. And then hybrid, of course, that bias just combines together, and I wouldn't say it's 1 + 1 = 1. It's probably additive to think about the complications of doing hybrid. But there's always a good thing in every part of this. There's a strength in every way that we can look at data. I'm going to show you a couple of published examples, and these are not necessarily reflective of decisions and regulatory decisions. I'm really thinking about telling you how we think about going about picking the data sources themselves. So this one is actually about stenting versus endarterectomy. And it's a published study of comparative effectiveness of CAS versus CE among Medicare beneficiaries. And it's an extremely powerful study because it really, all of the data comes from clinical care, but there were about 6 or 7 different sources that they were able to effectively link because the data was so strong. So there's Medicare data that was used. There was several patient registries that were used. There was a survey that got physicians linked, and then also American Medical Association identifiers. So they were actually able to look at the results between physicians and other things. So I'm going to go through a little bit about data relevance. These are the things we ask about data relevance, and again, this will be reflected in the work that Duke-Margolis puts out in October. But between all of these data sources, we did have exposure to the event. They had death, stroke, TIA, MI, and they had all of the covariates about patient demographics, comorbidities, the degree of stenosis, whether they're elected or emergent procedure, and surgeon characteristics. The representativeness of it was Medicare patients, so there is an element of systematic bias there, a certain population that's covered. You have to ask yourself, is that important in the context of the decision or not? There were sufficient subjects in this, and there was a complete exposure window because it was a survival model and we had the endpoints. Longitudinality was there as well, and then here are many of the linkages that happened to create this data set. This, to me, is a very robust way of looking across multiple data sources to come up with a feasible way of coming to an answer in a very specific population. This one is a little bit of a different scenario where we looked at, or where the sponsors looked at existing data and then realized there were certain things that were not there in order to make the decision. So this is about factors influencing treatment choice among patients in chronic idiopathic constipation and IBS with constipation. And what we could find is a lot of the data was actually in medical and pharmacy claims, but in order to get to the patients, you needed to get them a survey because that information is not recorded in EHRs or other things. And so what happened here is that in order to get this, they do a dual approach. So claims had diagnosis and drug disclosure, which then allowed the survey or the study team to develop an ERB-approved approach to contacting patients to participate in a survey in a diary. And so this was representative of medical and pharmacy claims enrollment information. That was approximately 12 million patients annually from a U.S. health plan with natural coverage, and it is geographically diverse and broadly representative. Here's where we probably get some systematic bias. Out of 18,000 participants that were mailed the survey and the diary request, there were 2,000, but still that's a significant number of patients that, again, gave us credibility in thinking that this data would appropriately get to our research question. And the availability of the consent elements, so it is extremely important to recognize that data is patient data. And so treating this data in a way that the patients are informed and allowed to opt in, and that we have appropriate ethical review or institutional review board oversight is really critical. So those things are also followed. So even data collection from patients and the linking part of that needs to be carefully handled and considered, respecting the patient's ownership of the data. That's it.
Thank you, BRANDE.